What if a single act of kindness, one you didn't have to do, one that cost you your own comfort, could change the entire course of your life and someone else's? We're not talking about a simple thank you. We're talking about a collision of fate so profound, it feels scripted. This is the story of Dr. Juliet Hayes, a brilliant surgeon who on a routine flight to Zurich made a choice in an instant. She gave up her expensive, hard-earned first-class seat for a distressed pregnant woman. But what happened next, high above the Atlantic, and in the sterile, high-stakes halls of a Swiss hospital, is a testament to the fact that our lives are connected in ways we can never, ever predict. Stay with us for a story of prejudice, desperation, and a twist of fate that will leave you breathless. The hum of the Boeing 707 was a lullaby of success. For Dr. Juliet Hayes, it was the perfect soundtrack to a moment she had meticulously earned. Settled into seat 3A on Swissair flight LX-139 from Newark to Zurich, the plush leather felt like a throne she had built for herself piece by piece through sleepless nights, grueling residences, and the constant quiet pressure of being twice as good to get half as much. At 34, Juliet was a titan in a field of giants, a pediatric cardiac surgeon whose innovative techniques were turning fatal prenatal diagnoses into hopeful futures. She breathed in the scent of warmed nuts and premium cabin air, a stark contrast to the antiseptic smell of the hospital that usually clung to her. Her destination was the World Symposium of Pediatric Medicine in Zurich, where she was the keynote speaker. Her presentation, stored securely on her encrypted laptop, contained data that could redefine the surgical approach for hypoplastic left heart syndrome, a devastating condition where a baby is born with only half a heart. This flight wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity. She needed to sleep to arrive rested and sharp. The lives of future children depended on her clarity. She had just accepted a glass of champagne from a smiling flight attendant named Olivia when the delicate peace of the first-class cabin was fractured. A man's voice, sharp and laced with an entitlement that grated on the ear, sliced through the quiet. "This is unacceptable," he boomed his voice, echoing slightly in the hushed environment. "Look at her. She can barely stand." Juliet glanced over. The man, who looked to be in his late 30s with a slicked-back haircut and a watch that cost more than her first car, was gesturing emphatically at a woman standing beside him. She was by any measure profoundly pregnant. Her belly was a perfect taut sphere under a grey cashmere sweater, and her face, pale and strained, was beaded with a fine layer of sweat. She leaned against the bulkhead, one hand pressed to the small of her back. Her eyes closed as if concentrating on breathing. This was Ruby Thompson. Her husband was Mark Thompson. Olivia, the flight attendant, maintained a professional, placid smile, but Juliet could see the tension in her jaw. "Sir, as we explained at the gate, your wife's ticket is for Economy Plus. We are completely booked in first and business class. There are no available seats." "Then make one available," Mark retorted, his voice dripping with condescension. "Use your eyes. My wife is carrying a child. She needs to elevate her legs. She needs to be comfortable. I'm a platinum medallion member, for God's sake." "What does that even mean, if you can't accommodate a simple, humane request?" Ruby opened her eyes, her gaze soft and apologetic. "Mark, please, it's all right," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. "I can manage. We knew it was a full flight." "No, Ruby, it's not all right," he snapped, turning his frustration on her. "We're flying to Zurich for the best possible care, and it starts with this flight. With you being cared for. Stress is the last thing you need." He turned back to Olivia. Somebody in one of these seats can move. His eyes swept the cabin, lingering for a fraction of a second too long on the elderly man in 2B before brazenly landing on Juliet. It was a look she knew all too well. The flicker of surprise, the quick calculation, the subtle judgment. How did she get here, the look said. Affirmative action, lottery winner. He didn't even try to hide it. He gestured vaguely in her direction. For instance, he began. Perhaps some people are flying for leisure, a vacation. My wife's situation is a medical necessity. Juliet felt a familiar heat rise in her chest. The fire of 1,000 tiny cuts. She had her laptop open, her presentation on the screen, the complex diagrams of a child's heart glowing softly. She could have flashed the screen mentioned she was the keynote speaker at a medical symposium, or simply held up her boarding pass that read, Dr. Juliet Hayes. But she remained silent, her expression unreadable. She watched the drama unfold, a knot tightening in her stomach. This man, with his arrogance and thinly veiled racism, was making it impossible for her to do what her heart was telling her to do. Olivia, a consummate professional, stepped in. Sir, I cannot ask another passenger to give up a seat they have paid for. All our first-class passengers have their reasons for being here. Oh, I'm sure they do. Mark said, his voice a low, sarcastic drawl as he stared directly at Juliet. That was it, the direct challenge, the public insinuation. Every fiber of Juliet's being screamed in protest. Don't you dare reward this man's bigotry. Don't you dare diminish your own hard-won success to placate his entitlement. She needed this seat. Her work, her career, the children she was fighting for, they all needed her to be at her best. Sleeping upright in economy for 9 hours was not the plan. But then her eyes moved from Mark's sneering face to Ruby's. The woman's eyes were glistening with unshed tears. It wasn't just physical discomfort, it was humiliation. Her husband was creating a scene, drawing the stares of the entire cabin, and she was the unwilling centerpiece. In her eyes, Juliet saw not the wife of an arrogant bully, but a mother-to-be, terrified and exhausted. She saw a woman carrying a precious life, and in that moment, the shared, unspoken bond of womanhood, of potential motherhood, transcended the ugliness of the situation. Juliet's training as a surgeon was to see the patient, not the noise around them. The patient here, in a sense, was Ruby and her unborn child. The disease was the stress and physical danger of a long, uncomfortable flight. With a slow, deliberate sigh, Juliet closed her laptop. The click echoed louder than Mark's shouting had. She undid her seatbelt. The entire front cabin was watching, silent. She stood up, her 5'9" frame, commanding a quiet authority. She looked past Mark directly at Ruby. "You can have my seat," Juliet said, her voice even and calm, betraying none of the internal turmoil. Ruby's head snapped up, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Oh no, I couldn't possibly." "Please," Juliet insisted, a soft but firm edge to her tone. "You need it more than I do. It's not a problem." Mark was momentarily speechless, a flicker of triumph crossing his face, before being replaced by a confused sort of suspicion. He had gotten what he wanted, but not in the way he'd intended. He had tried to bully the airline, not appeal to the charity of the very person he had disdained. "Well," he stammered, "that's very good of you." He made no move to thank her properly. Juliet ignored him. She gathered her bag and her laptop. Olivia, the flight attendant, rushed over her face a mixture of gratitude and apology. "Ma'am, you absolutely do not have to do this." "I know," Juliet said, giving her a small smile. But it's the right thing to do. She looked again at Ruby, who was now weeping silently. "Get some rest," she said gently. As Olivia led Juliet back through the business class curtain and into the tighter confines of Economy Plus, she leaned in. "I've arranged for 16C. It's an aisle in the exit row. It's the best I can do. All your drinks and food are on the house, of course. And Dr. Hayes," Olivia whispered, having clearly seen the name on her manifest. "What you just did. That was pure class. That man did not deserve it." Juliet sank into the significantly less plush seat of 16C. "No," she said, looking out the small window as the plane began its pushback from the gate. He didn't, but his wife did. As the engine spooled up, roaring to life, Juliet felt the vibration in her bones. She was tired already. She leaned her head against the cool plastic of the window. The image of Ruby's tear-streaked, grateful face burned into her mind. She had given up her comfort, her preparation, her quiet space. She had done it for a stranger. She had no idea that in giving up seat 3A, she hadn't just sacrificed her comfort. She had just stepped into the center of a storm that had been brewing for months. A storm that was racing towards Zurich at 500 miles per hour, carrying with it the desperate hopes of the very woman now sleeping in her bed. The next 7 hours for Juliet were a study in endurance. The exit row offered more legroom, a small mercy, but it couldn't replicate the serene cocoon of first class. To her left, a young, anxious, first-time flyer gripped the armrest with white knuckles. To her right across the aisle, a baby with surprisingly powerful lungs discovered the joy of shrieking at 30,000 feet. Sleep was a distant, mocking fantasy. She tried to work on her presentation, but the glow of the laptop in the darkened cabin felt intrusive. The complex medical diagrams seemed to blur into abstract shapes. She found herself reading the same sentence over and over, her mind drifting. She thought about the irony of it all. Here she was on her way to teach the world's best surgeons how to mend the tiniest of hearts, and she felt a profound sense of disquiet in her own. Mark's dismissive glare kept replaying in her mind. It wasn't the first time she had faced such prejudice, and it wouldn't be the last. It was a tax she paid for her success, a toll extracted by a world that was often slow to reconcile her identity, a black woman with her profession. Usually she could compartmentalize, file it away, under ignorant fool, and move on. But this time felt different. It was tangled up with an act of her own volition, an act of grace that felt in retrospect unreciprocated and perhaps even foolish. Meanwhile, in seat 3A, Ruby Thompson was not sleeping peacefully. The luxurious seat, the warm blanket, the attentive service, it all felt tainted. She was physically comfortable for the first time in days, her swollen ankles propped up on the ottoman, but her mind was a tempest of guilt and anxiety. She kept her eyes closed, feigning sleep, so she wouldn't have to talk to Mark. His triumphant, self-satisfied air after the confrontation had been nauseating. He saw it as a win, a situation he had successfully handled. He didn't see the shame it had caused her, or the quiet dignity of the woman he had implicitly insulted. Ruby's hand rested protectively on her belly, a constant, unconscious gesture. Inside her, their son, whom they had already named Leo, was a tiny, fragile warrior fighting a battle he didn't know he was in. The diagnosis had come 3 weeks ago, during a routine 32-week ultrasound. The silence in the room, the technician's face suddenly becoming a blank mask. The doctor's grave tone, it was all seared into her memory. Hyperplastic left heart syndrome. The words were clinical cold and utterly terrifying. The left side of Leo's heart was critically underdeveloped. The prognosis delivered by their team at one of New York's top hospitals was grim. A series of 3 high-risk surgeries after birth with no guarantee of long-term survival. A life of medication limitations and the constant threat of heart failure. A potential transplant down the line. Mark, a man who solved problems with money and aggression, had refused to accept it. He had spent a fortune on consultations, second opinions, and third opinions. They all said the same thing. Then a pediatric cardiologist in Boston, during a somber video call, had mentioned a name. The standard of care is the Norwood procedure, he'd said, but there's a surgeon, Dr. Juliet Hayes at Johns Hopkins. She's a bit of a maverick. She's pioneering a new in utero technique, a sort of fetal intervention, but it's highly experimental. And she's also developed a modified surgical approach post-birth that shows incredible promise. She's presenting her initial findings at the symposium in Zurich next week. If anyone can offer a sliver of a different hope, it's her. That name had become their religion. Dr. Juliet Hayes. They had researched her, read her published papers, or tried till the language was dense and impenetrable, and looked at her photo online. A serious, intelligent-looking black woman. Their Hail Mary. They couldn't get an appointment. Her schedule was booked a year in advance. Desperate Mark had made a snap decision. "We're going to Zurich," he declared. "We'll go to the conference. We'll find her. I'll pay whatever it takes. We will get in a room with this woman and convince her to save our son." So here they were, flying across the ocean, chasing a ghost of a chance, and the very first thing they had done was become embroiled in an ugly, classless scene. Ruby's guilt was a physical ache. The woman whose seat she had taken. What if she was flying to see a sick relative? What if she was heading to a funeral? Ruby had no idea, and her husband's behavior had made it impossible to even have a humane conversation. About 4 hours into the flight, a sharp, terrifying cramp seized Ruby's abdomen. It was followed by another and another. A wave of dizziness washed over her. She gasped, her hand flying to her belly. "Mark," she panted, her voice tight with panic. "Something's wrong." Mark, who had been sleeping soundly, jolted awake. "What? What is it? I'm cramping, it's bad, and I feel dizzy." Her heart was hammering against her ribs, a frantic bird trying to escape. Mark's face went pale. His usual bravado evaporated, replaced by sheer terror. He fumbled to press the call button, his hand shaking. "Flight attendant, we need help." Olivia was there in a second, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to Mark's panic. "What's happening?" "Mrs. Thompson." "It's my wife, she's—" He trailed off, helpless. "I'm having sharp pains," Ruby managed to say, "and I can't catch my breath." Olivia's training kicked in. She spoke into her headset, her voice low and urgent. "This is Olivia, at seat 3A. I have a medical situation. Pregnant passenger, 35 weeks, reporting severe cramping and dizziness." A moment later, a calm, disembodied voice came over the cabin PA system. "Attention passengers. If there is a medical doctor on board this aircraft, please identify yourself to a member of the cabin crew." Back in 16C, Juliet's head snapped up. The words cut through her fatigue-induced haze. Without a second's hesitation, she unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up. The flight attendant in her section saw her immediately. "I'm a doctor," Juliet said, already moving down the aisle towards the front of the plane. As she pushed through the curtain into the first-class cabin, she saw the scene. Ruby pale as a sheet, clutching her belly. Mark hovering uselessly, his face ashen, and Olivia trying to keep her calm. Juliet knelt beside the seat. "Hi, I'm Juliet," she said, her voice instantly taking on the soothing, authoritative tone she used with frightened parents in consultation rooms. "I'm a physician. Can you tell me what's happening?" Ruby's panicked eyes met hers. There was a flicker of recognition, but she was in too much distress to place her. "I'm having terrible cramps," she gasped, "and my heart is racing." Juliet gently took her wrist, her fingers finding the radial pulse. It was thready and fast. "Okay, let's take some deep, slow breaths together. In through your nose, out through your mouth. Like this." She exaggerated the breaths, and Ruby, her eyes locked on Juliet's, began to follow suit. "Olivia," Juliet said without looking up, "can you get me the onboard medical kit? I need a blood pressure cuff and a stethoscope, and a bottle of water, please." As Olivia hurried to comply, Juliet continued her assessment. "Ruby, is that your name? I'm going to ask you a few questions. Have you had any bleeding?" "No." "Any fluid leakage?" "No, I don't think so." "When was your last meal? Did you drink enough water today?" I had some nuts a while ago," Ruby stammered. "I haven't been very thirsty." The cuff and stethoscope arrived. Juliet expertly wrapped the cuff around Ruby's arm and pumped it up. She placed the stethoscope to her chest, listening intently. After a moment, she looked up. "Your blood pressure is a little low, and you're tachycardic, but your lungs are clear," she announced. "Your pulse is already starting to come down. You're severely dehydrated, and it looks like you're having a panic attack on top of what are likely Braxton Hicks contractions, which are very common. The stress and dehydration are making them feel much worse." She helped Ruby take small sips of water. She spoke to her in low, reassuring tones, explaining what was happening to her body, demystifying the fear. Mark stood by, watching in stunned silence. This woman, the one he had dismissed with a glance, was now a paragon of competence and grace, single-handedly diffusing a crisis he was utterly powerless to effect. He had never felt so small. Within 15 minutes, Ruby's color had returned. The cramping had subsided to a dull ache. Her breathing was even. "I think you're going to be okay," Juliet said, giving her hand a final reassuring squeeze. "Just keep sipping water for the rest of the flight and try to rest. When we land in Zurich, you should get checked out just to be safe. But I don't believe you're in preterm labor." Ruby looked at her, her eyes flooded with a profound, overwhelming sense of gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I was so scared. You were amazing." "It's my job," Juliet said with a small smile. "Well, not usually at 30,000 feet. She stood up, ready to return to her seat. Mark finally found his voice. Thank you," he mumbled, unable to meet her eyes. It was a pathetic excuse for an apology, but it was all he could manage. Juliet just nodded, then turned and walked back to her seat in 16C. As she sat down, the baby across the aisle started crying again. But this time Juliet barely heard it. She leaned her head back and closed her eyes, a strange sense of calm settling over her. The incident had recentered her. The pettiness of the earlier confrontation had vanished, replaced by the pure, unadulterated purpose of her calling. She hadn't just been a doctor. She had been a healer. She had calmed a frightened mother. She still had no idea who Ruby and Mark Thompson were. She didn't know about their unborn son, Leo, or the diagnosis that had sent them on this desperate journey. And they had no idea that the calm, kind doctor named Juliet was in fact the one person on Earth they had come to find, Dr. Juliet Hayes. The flight continued on through the darkness, a metal tube filled with secrets, hurtling everyone toward a reckoning in the morning light of Zurich. The descent into Zurich was a welcome reprieve. As the plane broke through a thick blanket of clouds, the snow-dusted peaks of the Alps emerged majestic and indifferent. The city below was a pristine jewel box of order and tranquility. For Juliet, it was a sight that usually filled her with excitement. Today, it just amplified her exhaustion. When the plane parked at the gate, the usual rush to disembark began. Juliet, having moved little for hours, felt a deep ache in her back and legs. As she waited for her turn to exit, the first-class passengers began to file past. Mark and Ruby Thompson approached. Mark avoided her gaze entirely, pushing past with a mumbled, "Excuse me." But Ruby stopped. Her face was still pale, but her eyes were clear and filled with an earnest if flustered gratitude. "I never got to thank you properly," she said, her voice low so others couldn't hear. "You were so kind, not just with the medical issue, but with the seat. My husband, he was out of line. I'm so sorry." "It's forgotten," Juliet said, and to her own surprise she meant it. The woman standing before her was not her husband's accomplice, but his captive audience. "Just take care of yourself, and your little one." "Thank you," Ruby said, again, clutching her purse. There was a desperate, haunted look in her eyes that Juliet couldn't quite place, a look that went beyond the stress of a difficult flight. Then she was gone, hurried along by an impatient Mark. Juliet retrieved her carry-on, deplaned, and navigated the sleek, efficient Zurich airport. After a surprisingly quick pass through immigration, she found a driver holding a sign with her name on it, a courtesy of the symposium organizers. The short drive to the Bauer Olac Hotel was a blur of clean streets and serene lake views. All she wanted was a hot shower and a few hours of sleep before her pre-conference dinner. The next morning, Juliet awoke feeling more human. The hotel bed had worked miracles. She dressed in a sharp, tailored navy blue suit, her presentation loaded onto a flash drive, her mind clear and focused. The hours of discomfort on the plane now seemed a distant memory, a small price to pay for the peace of mind she now felt. She had acted with integrity, and that was its own reward. She arrived at the conference hall, a state-of-the-art facility, buzzing with the energy of 1,000 brilliant minds. She saw familiar faces, colleagues from Johns Hopkins, rivals from the Mayo Clinic, mentors from her fellowship days. The air crackled with intellectual fervor. This was her world. This was where she belonged. Meanwhile, across town, Mark and Ruby Thompson were living a different reality. Their morning had been a frantic rush. A quick checkup at a local clinic had confirmed Juliet's diagnosis: dehydration and a panic attack, but it had done little to soothe their nerves. Their entire hope rested on getting to Dr. Juliet Hayes. They didn't have credentials for the symposium. Mark had tried to pull strings, call in favors, even offer exorbitant amounts of money. But the event was strictly for medical professionals. Undeterred, he had found a back door. A junior administrator, swayed by a story of a family medical emergency and a significant cash donation, had procured 2 last-minute observer passes for them. They didn't grant access to the workshops, but they would get them into the main hall for the keynote address. They found seats in the vast auditorium high up in the back. The room was immense, a sea of dark suits and attentive faces. A large screen on either side of the stage showed a close-up of the podium. Ruby's heart pounded. She scanned every face, looking for the woman from the photo they'd seen online. "Do you think she's here?" Ruby whispered, twisting a handkerchief in her hands. She has to be. Mark said, his voice tense. Her speech is the main event. We just have to be ready. The second she's done, we move. We can't let her disappear. His plan was simple. Corner her, plead their case, and refuse to take no for an answer. It was the only way he knew how to operate. A distinguished-looking man, the symposium's director, Dr. Alastair Finch, walked to the podium. The auditorium fell silent. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, esteemed colleagues. Dr." Finch began, his British accent, lending an air of gravitas to the proceedings. "It is my distinct honor to introduce our keynote speaker. This is a surgeon whose work is not merely incremental but paradigm-shifting, a mind that is poised to change the very textbook of our field." High in the back, Ruby leaned forward, her breath catching in her throat. Her research in fetal intervention and her groundbreaking postnatal surgical modifications for hypoplastic left heart syndrome have offered the first real glimmer of a new dawn for patients we once thought had little hope, Dr. Finch continued. Her courage, her innovation, and her unwavering dedication are an inspiration to us all. It is my profound pleasure to welcome from Johns Hopkins University, the brilliant Dr. Juliet Hayes. Mark and Ruby exchanged a glance of pure, unadulterated hope. This was it, the moment of truth. They stared at the stage entrance, waiting to finally lay eyes on their savior. And then she walked out. She was tall, poised, and confident in her navy blue suit. She moved to the podium, with a graceful authority, arranged her notes, and looked out at the audience of her peers. The giant screens on either side of the stage flickered to life, showing her face in perfect high-definition detail. In the back row, a strangled gasp escaped Ruby's lips. Her face drained of all color. The handkerchief fell from her nerveless fingers. Mark stared, his mouth hanging open. His mind refused to process what his eyes were seeing. He looked from the screen to the stage, then back to the screen. It was impossible. It couldn't be. But it was. The woman on the stage, the celebrated surgical genius, the maverick, Dr. Juliet Hayes, their last and only hope for their unborn son, was the woman from the airplane. The woman whose first-class seat they had taken. The woman his arrogance had targeted. The woman who had knelt by his wife's side and calmly, kindly saved her from a mid-air panic. The full weight of their actions, of his actions, crashed down on Mark Thompson with the force of a physical blow. He had not just been rude to a fellow passenger. He had insulted, demeaned, and belittled the one person on the planet who held his child's future in her hands. The irony was so cruel, so cosmically vicious, it felt like a nightmare. He had spent a fortune and crossed an ocean to beg for a miracle from a woman he had treated like she was less than nothing. Juliet, oblivious to the personal drama unfolding in the cheap seats, smiled warmly at the audience. "Thank you, Dr. Finch." She began, her voice crisp and clear, filling the auditorium. "The heart of a child is a fragile and complex universe." For Mark and Ruby, her voice was a death knell. They didn't hear her words. They could only hear the thunderous, mocking roar of fate. They had come to Zurich seeking a miracle, and they had begun by spitting in the face of the miracle worker. Dr. Juliet Hayes's keynote address was more than a success. It was a conquest. For 45 minutes, the vast, tiered auditorium filled with the brightest minds in pediatric medicine had been her classroom. She moved through her complex data with the grace of a dancer and the precision of a watchmaker, transforming cold statistics into a vibrant narrative of hope. The images on the screen behind her, the shadowy ultrasound of a malformed heart, followed by the robust, perfectly functioning organ post-surgery, told a story more powerful than any words. When she concluded, the silence held for a beat, a collective intake of breath before the room erupted. The standing ovation was not mere politeness. It was a wave of genuine, thunderous acclaim from her peers, a recognition that they had just witnessed the dawn of a new era in their field. It was the moment she had worked for her entire life, a powerful validation that washed over her, silencing the quiet, persistent whispers of self-doubt she had battled for years. She was guided from the stage to a serene private lounge overlooking Lake Zurich, the adrenaline from her presentation humming in her veins like a live wire. She accepted a glass of chilled water, the coolness a welcome anchor back to reality. She was just beginning to process the triumph when Dr. Alistair Finch, the symposium's director, entered the room. His usual affable expression was replaced by a look of consternation. "Juliet," he began, his voice low and troubled. "A magnificent presentation, truly one for the ages, but we find ourselves in a rather delicate situation." Juliet felt a knot of fatigue tighten in her shoulders. "Delicate, Alistair? What's wrong?" "There is a couple," he said, choosing his words with care. "They are not registered delegates, and I'm still not entirely sure how they gained entry. Though I have my suspicions it involved an overly empathetic and now unemployed junior administrator." He paused, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "They are quite insistent on speaking with you. They claim it is a matter of life and death. Their unborn child, you see. A severe diagnosis of hypoplastic left heart syndrome." Juliet felt a familiar pang of empathy. She received dozens of such requests a week. "Alistair, my schedule is packed. You know how it is. They need to go through the proper channels at the hospital." "I told them as much," he said, his gaze apologetic. "But they flew from New York for the sole purpose of finding you here. They seem to believe you are their only hope. Their name is Thompson." The name landed in the quiet room with the force of a physical blow. Thompson. It wasn't a name. It was a memory, sharp and unwelcome. The cramped confines of the aircraft cabin, the reek of entitlement from a man in a pristine suit, the sneer that had dismissed her entire existence in a single glance, and the pale, terrified face of his pregnant wife. The haunted, desperate look in Ruby's eyes as she deplaned now snapped into horrifying focus. It wasn't just travel stress. It was the terror of a mother who was about to lose her child. Juliet stared out the window at the placid lake, but her mind was 30,000 feet in the air, trapped in seat 16C. A cold, hard anger, the kind she had suppressed on the flight, flared in her chest. The audacity, the absolute galling nerve of that man to bully his way into her presence after treating her with such casual disdain. He didn't deserve her time. He didn't deserve her expertise. He deserved to be sent away to be forced to reckon with the consequences of a world where you couldn't always buy or demand your way to the front of the line. Dr. Finch saw the storm gather on her face. "Juliet," he said gently, "I can have security remove them. They have no right to be here. You have no obligation." He was right. She had no obligation. She could say no. She could protect the sanctity of her victory, the peace she had so profoundly earned. She could walk away, fly back to Baltimore, and immerse herself in the work she loved, leaving the Thompsons and their karma to sort themselves out. It would be just. It would be fair. But then the image of Mark's sneering face was replaced by another. The ghostly image from her presentation slides the tiny damaged heart of an infant. A patient. An innocent life caught in the crossfire of its parents' desperation and its father's bigotry. Her entire life's work, her sacred oath, was a promise made to that child, not to the parents. She had operated on the children of saints and sinners, the wealthy and the destitute. The identity of the parent was always irrelevant noise outside the operating room door. All that ever mattered was the patient. She closed her eyes, taking a single deep, centering breath. She made a choice that had little to do with forgiveness and everything to do with her fundamental identity as a healer. "No, Alistair," she said, her voice quiet but unshakable. "Don't have them removed. Show them in." Alistair nodded, a look of deep respect in his eyes, and left the room. A minute later, the door opened again. Mark and Ruby Thompson stepped inside, and the atmosphere grew heavy, thick with shame and desperation. They looked like people who had been hollowed out, their expensive clothes hanging on frames, diminished by fear. Ruby's face was ashen, her eyes red and swollen from weeping. She clutched a thick medical file to her chest as if it were the only thing holding her upright. But the real transformation was Mark. The man who had strode through the first-class cabin with such aggressive self-assurance was gone. This version was stooped, his shoulders slumped in defeat. His gaze was fixed on the plush carpet, unable to meet hers. When he finally spoke, his voice was a raw, broken thing, stripped of all its former arrogance. "Dr. Hayes." He began the name, a choked admission of his monumental error. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to look up, and the self-loathing in his eyes was stark and absolute. There are no words. No apology is sufficient for my behavior on the plane. It was monstrous. It wasn't just rude. It was racist. It was ignorant, and and I will be ashamed of it for the rest of my life. I have no right to be here. I have no right to ask you for anything." He faltered, a wave of emotion rendering him speechless. He had come to grovel, but now faced with the quiet dignity of the woman he had wronged. Even that felt like an overreach. Ruby stepped into the breach, her own voice trembling, but propelled by a fierce maternal urgency. "Dr. Hayes, please," she begged, taking a half step forward. "What my husband did, what we did, is inexcusable. But our son, his name is Leo. He doesn't deserve to pay for our sins. Please don't let my husband's ignorance be his death sentence." She extended the medical file, a desperate offering. "This is everything. All his scans, all the reports. They told us you were the only person in the world who might have a different answer. We never knew. We had no idea it was you." Juliet looked from Mark's bowed head to Ruby's pleading, tear-streaked face. In that moment, the anger that had simmered within her finally dissipated, replaced by the profound gravity of her purpose. She saw past the ugly scene on the airplane, and saw only two terrified parents who had reached the end of the earth and found their last hope was the woman they had wronged. With a slow, deliberate movement, Juliet walked forward. She did not offer a smile or a word of comfort. She simply extended her steady surgeon's hand and took the file. The transfer of the folder was a silent contract, an acknowledgement that the personal history between them was now secondary to the medical crisis contained within its pages. "Sit down," she said, her voice calm and professional, cutting through the emotional chaos. "Both of you." They sank onto a sofa, as if their legs could no longer support them. For the next hour, the world outside the lounge ceased to exist. Juliet sat in an armchair opposite them, the file open on her lap. She was no longer the woman from seat 3A. She was Dr. Hayes of Johns Hopkins. Her eyes scanned the pages, absorbing complex data with astonishing speed. She saw the clinical damning language: aortic atresia, mitral stenosis, severe ventricular hypoplasia. She mentally constructed a three-dimensional image of Leo's heart, turning it over in her mind, analyzing its flaws, and searching for any glimmer of surgical possibility. The room was silent, but for the rustle of paper and the soft, choked breaths from Ruby. Finally, Juliet began to ask questions. Maternal blood pressure throughout the pregnancy. "Normal until the flight," Ruby whispered. "Any family history of congenital heart defects on either side?" "None," Mark answered, his voice barely audible. Her questions were like scalpels, sharp, precise, and targeted. As they answered, their awe of her grew dwarfing even their fear. They were witnessing a level of mastery that was almost frightening in its intensity. This was the mind that held their son's life in the balance. After what felt like an eternity, Juliet gently closed the file and placed it on the table beside her. She leaned forward, her gaze meeting theirs directly. "It's severe," she stated, her tone leaving no room for false hope. "The reports are not exaggerating. This is one of the most complex presentations of hypoplastic left heart syndrome I have ever reviewed. The prognosis you were given for the standard 3-stage Norwood reconstruction is accurate. It would be a very long and difficult road, with a low probability of long-term success." Ruby let out a thin, wounded cry, burying her face in her hands. Mark reached for her, his own face a mask of despair. "However," Juliet said. The single word sliced through their grief, charged with an almost unbearable voltage. They both looked up, their eyes wide, with a fragile, terrified hope. "The specific morphology of his aortic arch," Juliet continued, "and the passable though stenotic mitral valve, it's a unique combination. It makes him a potential, and I must stress potential candidate for my modified hybrid procedure. It is new. It is extraordinarily high risk. I have only performed it 7 times. Mark leaned forward, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists. Were they successful? Juliet held his gaze, her own unflinching. She would not sugarcoat the truth. 6 of them were. The 7th child is still in the ICU. His prognosis is guarded. There are absolutely no guarantees. "We'll take it," Ruby said instantly, her voice suddenly clear and strong. The tears were gone, replaced by a steely resolve. "Whatever the risk, a chance with you is better than a guarantee with anyone else." Juliet nodded slowly, accepting their desperate faith. "This is what would have to happen. The procedure must be done within the first 48 to 72 hours of birth. You would need to relocate to Baltimore immediately. As soon as you can arrange a medical transfer for Ruby, you fly. You will live there, near the hospital, for months. It will be grueling emotionally and financially." "We don't care," Mark said, his voice thick with emotion, as he looked at her. "We'll sell our home, liquidate everything. We will do whatever you say. Dr. Hayes." "Juliet." "Thank you. But I have to ask. Why? After what I did, after how I treated you, why are you helping us?" Juliet looked at the broken man before her. The desire for retribution was gone, replaced by a profound sense of clarity about her own mission. "I'm not doing it for you, Mark," she said, her voice even and devoid of judgment. "And I'm not doing it to be magnanimous. I'm doing it for your son. He is my patient. My only concern is his heart. The rest," she said with a finality that closed the subject forever, "is just noise." The subsequent weeks were a blur of logistics and fear. Mark and Ruby flew to Baltimore, and moved into a sterile corporate apartment near Johns Hopkins. Their old life of luxury and certainty vanished, replaced by a new reality of waiting rooms and anxious dread. 3 weeks later, Ruby was induced. Leo Thompson was born weighing 5 pounds, his skin tinged with the dusky blue of a heart that could not sustain him. He was stabilized and rushed to the pediatric cardiac ICU. 6 hours after his birth, he was in Juliet's operating room. For 9 relentless hours, under the intense glare of the surgical lights, Juliet led her team in a painstaking battle for his life. Mark and Ruby sat in the waiting room, the minutes stretching into an eternity. All the power and influence Mark had ever wielded was useless here. He was just a terrified father praying to a universe he had just discovered was run not by wealth, but by things like grace and skill. Finally, long after night had fallen, the waiting room doors swung open. Juliet stood there, still in her pale blue scrubs, her mask hanging from her neck. She was visibly exhausted, a deep weariness etched around her eyes, but those eyes were bright with triumph. "He's a fighter," she said, and a small, weary smile touched her lips. "The procedure was extremely challenging, but we achieved full reconstruction. He's stable. The next 72 hours are critical, but his heart is whole." The dam of their composure broke. They collapsed into each other's arms, their sobs of relief echoing in the quiet hallway. Leo not only survived the 72 hours, he thrived. Weeks turned into months. He hit milestones his parents had been told he would never see. Mark and Ruby were transformed, their lives rebuilt around the fragile miracle they took home. Mark's arrogance had been burned away in the crucible of his fear and shame, replaced by a quiet, profound humility. 1 year later, during Leo's remarkable 1-year checkup, they asked to speak with Juliet privately after she had declared their son to be a healthy, vibrant toddler. "We've spent this past year thinking," Mark began, his voice steady, "about the choices we make, and the people we are, and the chances we don't deserve but are given anyway. What you did for us, Dr. Hayes, wasn't just a surgery. You didn't just save our son. You saved us. And you did it after we showed you the absolute worst of human nature." A thank you feels meaningless for a gift that large. Ruby continued, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "It can't just end with us being grateful. Your act of grace on that plane, giving up your comfort for a stranger when you had every right not to. It has to mean more. It has to ripple outward. So we did something." She handed Juliet a tablet. On the screen was a sleek professional website. The banner at the top read in bold, elegant letters, "The Hayes Foundation." Juliet stared at it, her mind struggling to comprehend. "We endowed it with an initial $10 million. Mark explained, his voice filled with a new, quiet purpose. "Its sole mission is to provide full 4-year scholarships for underprivileged women of color to attend medical school. It will cover everything: tuition, books, living expenses, research grants. We want to ensure that the world has more people like you, more brilliant women who won't have to fight so hard for the seat they've earned, whether it's at the head of an operating room or in first class on an airplane." Juliet looked from the glowing screen to their earnest faces. She saw the depth of their transformation, the sincerity of their mission. This was their apology, written not in words, but in action. It was a legacy. Her single split-second decision on Flight L-139, a choice to rise above an insult to answer ugliness with grace, had not only saved one precious life, it had now paved the way for countless others, creating a future filled with doctors who looked like her who might not have had a chance otherwise. Tears welled in Juliet's eyes, blurring the name on the screen. She thought of the little girl she had been, a girl with an impossible dream. Now her name was on a foundation that would make that dream a reality for a new generation. That was the truly unforgettable thing, not the insult, not the apology, not even the miraculous surgery. It was this, the awesome, transformative power of a single act of kindness rippling out through time to change the world in ways she never could have predicted. The weight of her first-class seat, she now understood, was never in its comfort or its cost, but in the immeasurable, world-altering value of giving it away. The story of Dr. Juliet Hayes and the Thompson family is a powerful reminder that our world is intricately connected in ways we can't possibly see. One small sacrifice, one decision to choose grace over anger, set in motion a chain of events that resulted in not just one miracle, but countless more to come through the Hayes Foundation. It reminds us that behind every face is a story we don't know, a battle we don't see. Mark Thompson's initial prejudice could have cost him everything, but Dr. Hayes' profound professionalism and humanity rewrote their family's future. Their story challenges us to look past our own assumptions and to consider the ripple effects of our own actions. How might a single act of your own kindness change someone's world? If this story touched your heart, please give this video a like and share it with someone who needs to hear a story of hope and redemption. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable real-life dramas that reveal the extraordinary power of the human spirit. Click that notification bell so you never miss a story. Thank you for watching.